"We can't afford 2 tickets," Margaret said calmly, as if she were discussing the weather. "So Claire will stay in the beach house, and you'll need to arrange a truck for your things." Emily Whitmore didn't argue. She didn't even blink. The words hung in the air of the sunlit living room, drifting between the floral curtains and the framed photographs of a family that once looked balanced, once looked whole. Outside, a late April breeze moved gently through the oak trees lining the driveway of the 2-story colonial where she had grown up, a house her father had bought 35 years earlier when interest rates were high and hope was higher. Margaret sat upright in her favorite wingback chair, hands folded neatly in her lap, her silver hair pinned into its usual tidy bun. Claire stood behind her, one hand resting lightly on their mother's shoulder, her expression composed, almost protective. The decision had already been made before Emily arrived that morning. She could see it in the way Claire avoided her eyes, in the way the suitcase by the hallway table had been zipped and placed there as if by accident. Margaret continued speaking in that measured tone she had perfected over 72 years, explaining that the Florida rental was small, that expenses had gone up, that property taxes on the house were higher than expected this year. She spoke about practicality, about space, about how it made sense. Emily listened, hands resting at her sides, her gaze drifting toward the hallway where her childhood bedroom still held the same pale blue walls. It wasn't the money. She knew that. Her father's life insurance policy had been substantial. The brokerage account, which Emily herself had helped manage during the worst months of her father's illness, had grown steadily. 2 plane tickets, $800 each at most, would not have strained anything. But Margaret didn't mention the account. She didn't mention that Claire had taken over the online banking the previous summer to make things easier. Instead, she said the word afford again, soft but final. Claire finally spoke, her voice gentle, almost rehearsed. She said it would only be temporary. That Emily was strong, independent, capable of finding a place closer to her own work. That it might even be good for her. The phrases sounded polished, like lines repeated in front of a mirror. Emily nodded once. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. A clock ticked above the fireplace, steady and indifferent. She thought about the year her father had undergone heart surgery, how she had driven 8 hours every weekend to sit beside his hospital bed while Claire managed conference calls from the cafeteria. She remembered wiring money quietly when medical bills arrived faster than expected. No one had called that unaffordable. Margaret shifted slightly in her chair. There was no anger in her face, only resolve, as if removing one daughter from the picture was simply a matter of logistics. Emily glanced toward the driveway, just as a white rental truck turned the corner and rolled slowly to the curb. She hadn't ordered it yet, but she recognized the company logo. Claire followed her gaze and cleared her throat softly. "It's easier this way," she said. The words landed gently, but they carried weight. Emily inhaled once, steady and controlled. She walked past the framed wedding portrait of her parents, past the console table where unopened mail rested in a tidy stack. At the doorway, she paused, turning slightly. Margaret did not stand. She did not offer a hug. Instead, she gave a small nod, as though approving a plan already in motion. The truck engine idled outside, a low mechanical hum beneath the quiet afternoon. Emily reached for the suitcase by the hallway table. It felt lighter than she expected. She lifted it without struggle. Through the front window, the sky stretched wide and bright, deceptively peaceful. No one raised their voice. No one cried. The decision had been delivered with the same calm tone Margaret once used to announce dinner was ready. And just like that, one daughter would remain in the beach house by the Gulf, and the other would begin packing up a life measured not in dollars, but in distance. The truck was still parked at the curb when Emily carried the first box down the front steps, and the afternoon sun made the windshield glare so brightly that she had to squint as she walked. The driver, a young man in a Navy uniform, waited politely beside the open cargo door, checking something on his tablet and pretending not to notice the quiet tension that seemed to settle over the property like a thin layer of dust. Inside the house, Margaret remained in her chair, and Claire moved through the hallway with deliberate efficiency, opening closets and handing out empty boxes as if she were helping someone prepare for a cross-country relocation instead of watching her sister leave her childhood home. Emily did not rush. She folded her sweaters carefully, stacking them the way she had learned in high school when her mother insisted that presentation mattered even inside a drawer. Each object she picked up felt heavier than it should have. The framed photograph from her college graduation. The ceramic lamp her father had bought at a roadside market in North Carolina during a summer vacation 15 years ago. The small cedar chest at the foot of her bed, still faintly scented from decades of storage. She carried each item downstairs without comment, placing them inside the truck in neat rows. Claire followed once, standing near the doorway with her arms crossed loosely over her chest. She spoke about practical things, about how property values in the neighborhood had increased by nearly 12% in the past year, about how maintaining a 5-bedroom house at Margaret's age required planning. She mentioned insurance premiums and utility costs, as if they were weather patterns no one could control. Emily listened without responding. She remembered when their father had refinanced the mortgage after the recession, how he had explained every number at the kitchen table, tapping the calculator with patient fingers. He had always believed in clarity. Margaret had believed in harmony. After he passed away 3 years earlier, the two concepts seemed to drift apart. In the months that followed his funeral, Claire began stopping by every afternoon. At first it looked like devotion. She organized paperwork, sorted through file cabinets, and insisted on updating passwords for safety. Margaret appeared relieved to let someone else manage the details. Emily had been grateful then, living nearly 2 states away, working long hours in a consulting firm that required weekly flights and constant deadlines. She had trusted her sister. She had trusted the quiet assumption that family loyalty did not require supervision. A breeze pushed through the open front door, lifting the edge of the hallway rug slightly. The house no longer sounded the same. Without furniture in her bedroom, the space echoed faintly. Margaret finally stood and walked slowly toward the foyer. She watched as another box disappeared into the truck. There was no anger in her expression, only a kind of distant calm, as if she were observing a necessary renovation rather than a departure. Claire reached for Margaret's elbow gently, guiding her back inside before the sun grew too warm. Emily noticed the gesture. Protective, possessive, hard to tell the difference anymore. The truck filled steadily, square foot by square foot. By late afternoon, the driver closed the cargo door with a soft metallic click. Emily wiped her hands on her jeans and looked once more at the front porch swing where she and Claire used to sit on humid summer nights counting lightning bugs across the lawn. Nothing about the house had changed physically. The paint was still cream-colored, the shutters still navy blue. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the quiet spaces between words. Margaret did not step outside to say goodbye. Claire offered a small wave from the doorway, her smile restrained and carefully measured. Emily climbed into the cab of the truck, fastening her seat belt slowly. As the engine started and the tires rolled over the familiar cracks in the driveway, the house grew smaller in the rearview mirror, steady and unmoving, as if it had already accepted the version of the story that required only one daughter to remain. The highway stretched out in front of the rental truck in a long, unbroken ribbon of asphalt, and Emily kept both hands steady on the steering wheel as the late afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky. The navigation system displayed 4 hours and 32 minutes to her apartment in Nashville, a place she had signed a lease for only 6 months earlier, never imagining she would return with everything she owned packed behind her in a cargo box. Traffic moved at a steady 70 miles per hour, and the hum of the engine filled the cab with a low, constant vibration that left little room for thought, yet her mind did not stay quiet. She replayed the scene from the living room, the tone of Margaret's voice, the careful precision of Claire's explanations. It was not the words themselves that unsettled her. It was the absence of hesitation. Decisions that once required discussion had been delivered like finished instructions. At a rest stop near the state line, she pulled into a parking space reserved for oversized vehicles and stepped out into the cool evening air. The sky was turning pale, pink, and a row of semi-trucks idled nearby. She leaned against the door for a moment, letting the silence settle. Her phone vibrated once in her pocket. A text from Claire appeared on the screen. It read that she hoped the drive was smooth and that everything would make sense in time. There was no mention of money, no mention of the account their father had built over decades. Emily typed a brief response that said she arrived safely and would call later. She did not press send. Instead, she slipped the phone back into her pocket and walked toward the vending machines without buying anything. When she returned to the truck, she noticed something small but sharp in her memory. The previous autumn, Margaret had mentioned that the dividend from the investment portfolio had been lower than expected. Claire had quickly corrected her, saying the funds had been reallocated for better growth. Emily had not questioned it then. She had trusted the word growth the way people trust the word safety. Now, standing beneath the fading light, she wondered when the language inside her family had changed from shared to controlled. She climbed back into the driver's seat and resumed the drive. The road signs began to list distances in shrinking increments. 50 miles. 25. 10. With each marker, she felt less like someone being removed and more like someone observing a pattern from a distance. Margaret had always favored the daughter who remained physically present. Claire attended church with her, handled repairs, joined neighborhood committees. Presence looked like devotion. Distance looked like indifference. It did not matter that Emily's transfers to the household account had paid for roof repairs 2 summers ago, or that she had covered the deductible when their father's car needed a new transmission. Those transactions had been quiet. They had not involved casseroles or weekly visits. As the city lights appeared ahead, she realized that the narrative forming back home would likely be simple. One daughter stayed to care. The other left to pursue her own life. It was a cleaner story than the truth. She exited the highway and navigated the familiar streets toward her apartment complex, a 3-story brick building near a grocery store and a small park. When she parked and turned off the engine, the sudden silence felt heavier than the drive itself. The truck behind her carried furniture in boxes. It also carried questions she had not yet asked aloud. She stepped out and looked up at the dimly lit windows of her unit on the 2nd floor. Tomorrow she would unpack. Tomorrow she would return the truck. Tonight, she stood still in the parking lot, aware that something larger than a relocation had occurred, something measured not in miles but in the quiet rearrangement of loyalty and control. Emily did not unpack everything the first night. She carried only the essentials up the narrow staircase to her 2nd-floor apartment, leaving the heavier furniture inside the truck until morning. The living room felt smaller than she remembered, the ceiling lower, the air slightly stale from a week of being unoccupied. She set her suitcase near the sofa and walked slowly through each room, turning on lamps instead of the overhead lights. Soft light made the space feel less temporary. In the kitchen, she opened the refrigerator and found a single bottle of water she had left behind before driving north. She drank half of it while standing at the counter, staring at the blank wall where a calendar should have been. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Margaret. The message was short and carefully worded. She hoped the trip had gone smoothly. She said she trusted Emily understood that difficult decisions had to be made. She added that Claire would handle the beach house logistics and that everything was for the best. There was no apology. There was no explanation about the finances. Emily read the message twice, then placed the phone face down on the counter. The phrase difficult decisions lingered in her mind. She remembered another difficult decision from years earlier, when her father considered selling a portion of his company shares during a downturn in the market. He had gathered both daughters at the dining room table and laid out every number in detail. He had asked for their thoughts, even though they were still in their 20s at the time. He believed transparency built trust. After his passing, transparency seemed to have been replaced by efficiency. Claire moved quickly. Passwords changed. Statements redirected. Margaret deferred. Emily had not noticed the speed at which control shifted because she believed proximity meant loyalty. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the apartment blinds in thin golden lines. Emily returned the truck before 9:00, signed the final paperwork, and walked back to her car with steady steps. She drove to a small coffee shop near her office and ordered a medium black coffee, sitting by the window with her laptop open but untouched. Instead of checking emails, she logged into the old shared folder she and her father had once used to track household investments. Most of the files had been removed, but a few archived documents remained. She studied the figures carefully, comparing them to the last statements she remembered reviewing nearly 18 months ago. The numbers did not align. Funds had been shifted into a new account labeled under a joint management structure. Claire's name appeared beside Margaret's. Emily closed the laptop slowly. The room around her felt quiet and ordinary, filled with the soft hum of espresso machines and low conversations. No one knew that her understanding of her family had tilted slightly off-center. She did not feel rage. She felt clarity. The removal from the house had not been about tickets or square footage. It had been about consolidation. Control is easier to maintain when fewer voices remain. She sipped her coffee and watched pedestrians cross the street outside, moving with purpose, unaware of the invisible negotiations that shape private lives. For the first time since the truck had pulled away from the curb, Emily felt less displaced and more aware. Distance, she realized, could reveal patterns that closeness concealed. And as she sat there in the quiet corner of the cafe, she understood that what had happened was not an accident of budgeting, but the result of decisions made long before the moving boxes were packed. Emily did not call her mother that afternoon. Instead, she drove from the coffee shop to her office building, a 12-story glass structure that reflected the Tennessee sky like a mirror. She moved through the lobby with the same composed expression she had worn while loading boxes into the truck, greeting the security guard with a polite nod before stepping into the elevator. Work had always been the one place where outcomes followed effort in measurable ways. Numbers aligned or they did not. Contracts were signed or they were not. There was no room for unspoken hierarchies disguised as practicality. Once inside her office, she closed the door gently and sat at her desk without turning on the overhead light. She opened her laptop again, this time pulling up archived emails from the months after her father's funeral. There were messages from Margaret thanking Claire for helping with paperwork. There were confirmations of account updates, notifications about beneficiary adjustments, polite acknowledgments that administrative responsibilities had been simplified. Simplified. The word appeared more than once. Emily leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Simplification often meant consolidation. Consolidation often meant control. Around 3 in the afternoon, she made a decision that felt neither dramatic nor impulsive. She searched for the contact information of her father's longtime attorney, Harrison Cole, a man who had attended holiday dinners for nearly 2 decades and who had once explained estate planning to both daughters in clear, patient detail. His office was still listed downtown, only 15 minutes away. She dialed the number and asked if he was available for a brief consultation. The receptionist recognized her name immediately and offered an appointment the following morning. That evening, back in her apartment, Emily opened the last box she had brought upstairs. Inside were neatly organized folders labeled in her father's handwriting. Retirement accounts, property deeds, trust documents. She sat cross-legged on the living room floor, spreading the papers around her like pieces of a puzzle. One document caught her attention, a clause within the family trust stating that any significant financial restructuring required written acknowledgement from both designated beneficiaries unless one formally declined involvement. She did not remember declining anything. The next morning, she arrived at Harrison Cole's office precisely at 9 o'clock. The waiting area smelled faintly of polished wood and brewed coffee. When he stepped out to greet her, his expression shifted from polite professionalism to quiet concern. She explained the relocation in simple terms. She described the financial adjustments she had noticed. She did not accuse. She presented facts. Harrison listened carefully, reviewing the documents she placed on his desk. He adjusted his glasses and read each page slowly. After several minutes, he exhaled in a measured way. He explained that while Margaret retained primary authority over her assets, the trust contained safeguards designed specifically to prevent unilateral consolidation that disadvantaged one beneficiary. He asked whether she had signed any formal waiver. She shook her head. The room felt calm, almost ordinary, yet beneath the steady tone of legal language, something significant took shape. Harrison suggested requesting a full accounting of recent transactions, not as an accusation, as a clarification. Emily nodded. She did not feel anger rising. She felt structure returning. By the time she stepped back onto the sidewalk, the late morning sun had warmed the pavement. Cars moved steadily along the street, indifferent to private revelations unfolding inside office buildings. She realized then that the moving truck had not been the end of something, but the visible symptom of a quieter shift that had begun months earlier. And for the first time since leaving the house, she understood that she did not need to raise her voice to change the direction of what was happening. She only needed the right documents and the patience to let clarity do the work. Harrison Cole sent the formal request for a full accounting 3 days later, printed on heavy letterhead and delivered both by certified mail and secure electronic copy. The language was precise and calm, asking for documentation of any asset reallocation, beneficiary modification, or account consolidation executed within the previous 18 months. There were no accusations in the document, only references to clauses, dates, and signatures. When Emily received confirmation that the notice had been delivered, she did not call her mother. She did not call Claire. She waited. Waiting, she realized, required more discipline than confrontation. On the fourth evening after the letter was sent, her phone rang just after 7 o'clock. Margaret's name appeared on the screen. Emily let it ring twice before answering. Her mother's voice sounded steady, but there was a slight tension beneath the surface, like a violin string pulled too tight. She asked why a lawyer had contacted her. She asked whether this was truly necessary. Emily replied in the same measured tone she had used inside Harrison's office. She explained that clarity protected everyone. She said she only wanted to understand the changes that had taken place. There was a pause long enough for both women to hear each other breathing. Margaret mentioned that Claire had been handling most financial details because it was easier. Easier had become a familiar word. Emily responded that easier did not replace transparent. The call ended without raised voices. Later that night, Claire sent a longer message. She wrote that the legal inquiry felt hostile. She wrote that Emily was overreacting and that moving accounts had been a strategic decision to maximize returns. She included phrases about loyalty and trust. Emily read the message once, then placed the phone on her kitchen counter without replying. In the days that followed, Harrison forwarded partial statements that began arriving from Margaret's bank. The documents showed transfers from the primary investment portfolio into a newly established joint account with survivorship rights. The majority of the funds had been placed under a structure that would automatically pass to Claire upon Margaret's death, bypassing the trust language entirely. Harrison called Emily that afternoon. His voice remained professional, but the gravity of the information was unmistakable. He explained that while Margaret retained authority to manage her assets, any restructuring that undermined the intent of the trust could be challenged if it was executed under undue influence or without informed consent. Emily sat at her dining table with the documents spread in front of her, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the pages. She studied the dates carefully. Several transfers had occurred within weeks of her father's passing, when Margaret had been grieving and dependent on assistance. Claire's name appeared repeatedly as authorized manager. The pattern was not chaotic. It was systematic. That evening, Margaret called again. This time her voice carried a trace of uncertainty. She asked whether there was truly a problem. Emily answered gently, explaining what the joint survivorship designation meant. She described how it altered the distribution originally outlined in the trust. There was silence on the other end. Margaret admitted she had signed documents Claire presented without reading every page. She said she trusted her. The admission was quiet, almost fragile. Emily felt no surge of triumph, only a deepening understanding of how proximity can shape perception. Claire had not shouted or demanded. She had simplified. She had presented options during moments of vulnerability. She had framed consolidation as protection. The next morning, Harrison filed a formal notice requesting temporary review of the restructured accounts, pending clarification of intent. The legal process moved forward not with confrontation, but with documentation. Claire called twice that afternoon. Emily did not answer immediately. When she finally returned the call, her sister's composure sounded thinner than before. She asked why Emily was doing this. Emily responded with a sentence she had rehearsed in her mind since leaving the house. She said she was not doing anything against the family. She was simply restoring the balance that had always been promised. The line went quiet, and in that silence, the first visible crack appeared in a structure that had seemed untouchable only weeks earlier. The formal review notice created a shift that could not be ignored, and within a week Harrison Cole arranged a mediated meeting at his downtown office, inviting both Margaret and Claire to attend in person. Emily arrived first, taking a seat at the long walnut conference table and placing a single leather folder in front of her. She wore a simple navy blazer and kept her expression neutral, neither defensive nor eager. When the door opened and Margaret stepped inside, she looked smaller than Emily remembered, her posture slightly curved, her handbag clutched tightly in both hands. Claire followed close behind, composed as always, her movements controlled, her eyes sharp. They greeted one another politely, the kind of restrained civility reserved for public spaces where voices must remain measured. Harrison began by summarizing the purpose of the meeting. He explained that the trust established by Robert Whitmore had been designed to ensure equitable distribution between both daughters. He referenced specific clauses regarding reallocation and survivorship structures. His tone was steady, his language factual. He placed copies of the financial summaries in front of Margaret. Claire leaned forward, pointing to certain lines and reiterating her earlier explanation that the joint account provided flexibility and tax advantages. She spoke confidently, as if she had rehearsed every response. Margaret listened, eyes moving slowly across the printed pages. When Harrison gently clarified that the survivorship designation would effectively override the trust's equal distribution, Margaret's expression shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who did not know her well. But Emily noticed the pause. Margaret admitted she had trusted Claire to manage the paperwork during a time when she felt overwhelmed. She said she had believed everything remained fair. Claire interjected, insisting there was no intent to exclude anyone. She said consolidation was efficient. She said having one manager prevented confusion. Emily did not interrupt. She waited until the room fell quiet. Then she spoke in a calm, even voice, explaining that she had never declined her role as co-beneficiary. She described the weekend hospital visits, the financial transfers, the support given without expectation of control. She did not accuse Claire of manipulation. She described only sequence and impact. Harrison outlined the legal options available. He explained that if Margaret wished to reaffirm equal distribution, corrective documentation could be filed to realign the accounts with the trust's original intent. The decision, he emphasized, belonged entirely to Margaret. The room felt still. Outside the window, traffic moved steadily along the street, ordinary and indifferent. Margaret looked from one daughter to the other. Years of habit pulled her toward the one who sat closest. Years of memory drew her toward the one who now sat across the table. After a long moment, she spoke quietly. She said she had not intended to create division. She said she believed both daughters deserved security. Claire's composure tightened slightly. Emily remained silent. Margaret then turned to Harrison and asked what steps were required to restore the accounts to their original structure. The air shifted subtly, like the moment before a summer storm changes direction. Claire objected softly, mentioning efficiency again, mentioning planning. Margaret placed her hand flat on the table, steady. She said planning should not mean imbalance. Harrison began outlining the paperwork necessary to revoke the survivorship designation and re-establish equal oversight. Emily did not smile. She did not look triumphant. She simply listened as the framework her father had once described was carefully reconstructed in legal language. When the meeting concluded, Margaret stood slowly. Claire gathered her purse without meeting Emily's eyes. In the hallway, the silence between the sisters felt different from before. Not hostile, not reconciled, just altered. And as Emily stepped outside into the bright midday sun, she understood that the most decisive shifts often happen in rooms where no one raises their voice, and every sentence is measured in careful restraint. The paperwork to restore the original trust structure was finalized within 2 weeks, and during that time the silence between the sisters expanded into something more defined. Claire did not call. She did not send long explanations about efficiency or strategy. Margaret, however, began reaching out more often, her voice carrying a softness that had not been present before. She asked about Nashville. She asked whether Emily had unpacked the cedar chest. She asked whether the apartment felt comfortable. Emily answered each question calmly, describing the small park across the street, the grocery store within walking distance, the quiet rhythm of her workdays. She did not mention the strain she still felt when she thought about the house. She did not need to. One Saturday morning, nearly a month after the meeting at Harrison Cole's office, Margaret arrived unexpectedly at Emily's apartment building. She had driven the 300 miles alone, something she had not done in years. When Emily opened the door and saw her mother standing in the hallway holding a small overnight bag, she stepped aside without hesitation. Margaret looked around the living room slowly, taking in the neutral walls and modest furnishings. She sat at the kitchen table while Emily brewed coffee, her movements careful, deliberate. For several minutes, they spoke about ordinary things. Traffic on the interstate, the weather along the way, the quality of the coffee beans. Eventually, Margaret folded her hands on the table and admitted that she had allowed convenience to replace clarity. She said she had believed that trusting one daughter completely would prevent conflict. She acknowledged that she had mistaken proximity for fairness. Emily listened without interrupting. She did not seek validation. She did not recount the moving truck or the silence in the living room. Margaret's voice wavered slightly as she described signing documents she had not fully understood. She admitted that Claire's confidence had been reassuring during a time when she felt vulnerable and uncertain. She said she had not intended to create imbalance, yet she recognized that imbalance had occurred. Emily responded gently, explaining that equal standing did not threaten unity. She said that transparency was not a challenge to authority, but a safeguard for it. Margaret nodded slowly. Later that afternoon, they walked together through the small park across the street. Children played on the swings. Couples walked dogs along the paved path. The scene felt steady and uncomplicated. Margaret paused near a bench and looked at her daughter with an expression that held both regret and recognition. She said she had always believed she was keeping the family together by simplifying decisions. She now understood that removing one voice did not create harmony. It created silence. That evening, they shared dinner at a nearby restaurant, choosing a quiet booth by the window. The conversation remained measured, reflective rather than reactive. Claire's name surfaced only briefly. Margaret said she would speak with her privately, not to accuse but to redefine boundaries. Emily did not ask for confrontation. She asked only for clarity moving forward. When Margaret prepared to leave the next morning, she placed her hand lightly on Emily's shoulder. The gesture felt different from before. Not protective, not possessive, simply present. As the car pulled away from the curb, Emily stood on the sidewalk and watched until it disappeared beyond the corner. The apartment behind her felt less temporary now, less like a consequence and more like a chosen space. The moving truck had carried furniture. The legal review had restored structure. But the most significant shift had happened quietly, in conversations measured by honesty instead of convenience. And in that quiet shift, the foundation of the family began to realign, not through force, but through acknowledgement. Autumn arrived gradually, painting the trees along the Tennessee streets in muted shades of amber and rust, and with it came a steadier rhythm to Emily's life. The restored trust documentation had been finalized and filed, the accounts restructured to reflect the original intent her father had once outlined at the kitchen table. There were no dramatic announcements, no public declarations of victory. The changes existed quietly in statements and signatures, in balanced columns of numbers that once again carried both daughters' names with equal weight. Claire called only once after Margaret's visit to Nashville. The conversation was brief and carefully contained. She acknowledged the revisions without apology, framing them as a mutual agreement rather than a correction. Emily did not challenge the phrasing. She had learned that language often reveals more through omission than emphasis. Instead, she spoke about practical matters, about upcoming holidays and potential travel plans, allowing the tone to remain steady and restrained. Distance, she realized, did not require hostility. It required boundaries. Margaret began splitting her time more intentionally, spending several weeks in Nashville before returning to her own house. During those visits, she moved more slowly through conversations, asking questions rather than issuing conclusions. One evening, while they prepared dinner together in the small apartment kitchen, Margaret paused at the stove and admitted that she had confused presence with loyalty. She said she had believed that the daughter who stayed physically close must also carry the purest intentions. Emily stirred the sauce gently and replied that proximity and integrity are not the same measurement. Margaret nodded, absorbing the distinction without defensiveness. Months earlier, such a statement might have sparked correction. Now it invited reflection. Winter approached, bringing shorter days and colder mornings. On a clear December afternoon, Emily drove back to the house she had left behind, not to reclaim a room, but to attend a family gathering arranged by Margaret with deliberate care. The living room looked unchanged, yet it felt different. The air carried less assumption. Claire greeted her politely, offering a small smile that did not attempt dominance. Conversation moved cautiously at first, then settled into something resembling normalcy. No one mentioned the truck. No one referenced the legal review. The absence of those topics was not avoidance. It was acknowledgement that the lesson had already been learned. After dinner, Emily stepped onto the porch alone, watching her breath form faint clouds in the cold air. The house stood solid and familiar, its shutters still navy blue, its paint still cream-colored. She no longer saw it as a place that had expelled her. She saw it as a structure that had revealed where lines needed to be drawn. Inside, Margaret laughed softly at something Claire said. The sound carried through the open doorway, lighter than it had been in months. Emily did not feel displaced. She felt balanced. The moving truck had once symbolized removal. Now it represented transition. It had forced clarity where assumption once lived. As she re-entered the house, she noticed that Margaret had set two identical place settings for dessert at the kitchen counter, positioned side by side. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, yet it held quiet meaning. Equal space, equal acknowledgement. No speeches were given. No apologies demanded. The family adjusted not through confrontation, but through recalibration. And as the evening drew to a close, Emily understood that stability does not come from occupying the same room. It comes from ensuring that when decisions are made, every voice remains present, whether near or far.